Very good morning, students. How are you all? I hope you all are keeping well. Students, now we will have revision of all the chapters which are coming in our upcoming exam. In today's lecture, students, we are going to have revision of the first chapter of Hornbill book. The name of the lesson is The Portrait of a Lady, written by Khushwant Singh. But students, let us see first of all the chapter highlights or the chief points of the lessons are as follows. First is the author's grandmother. Second is the author's childhood with his grandmother. Next is the author at school. And then next comes the turning point in the relationship of grandmother and the author. Then students, the grandmother distressed and disturbed. And next is the common link of friendship gets snapped. Next point is students, the author leaves for higher studies and the grandmother celebrates the author's return and eventually she falls sick. And then students, grandmother's death and the sparrows mourn her death. So these are the chapter highlights of the lesson. Now students, the story begins. Student, the portrait of a lady is part of an autobiography by Khushwant Singh. And students, in this story, the author draws a pen portrait of his grandmother. He beautifully unfolds their relationship and how it undergoes several changes. So, in other words, student, we can say the story actually is a loving tribute from a grandson to his grandmother. Student, the story gives us a picture of human relationship. The author remembers his grandmother and grandfather, and the author recalls his grandmother as a very old lady. For the 20 years that the author had known his grandmother, students, he had found her he had found her old and wrinkled only, and it was hard for him to believe that she had once been young and pretty and she had a husband. And student, the thought of the grandmother being young and pretty was almost revolting for him. She was short, fat, slightly bent in stature, and her face was a crisscross of wrinkles, as you can see here in the picture also. And her silvery white hair was scattered over her wrinkled face. Student, the author remembered her hobbling round the house in spotless white clothes, with one hand resting on her waist to balance her stoop, and the other hand busy counting the beads of her rosary. She was a very spiritual lady. Her lips constantly moved in inaudible prayer, students. And student, to the author, she could never have been pretty, but she reflected a divine beauty. So she was like the winter landscape in the mountains. Then, student, the author and his grandmother were good friends. His parents left him to stay with her when they shifted to the city. So, students, in the village, his grandmother took care of all his needs. She was quite active and agile. She used to wake him up in the morning, students, and get him ready for school. She said her morning prayers in a sing-song manner, while she bathed and dressed him in the hope that her grandson also would learn them by heart. So, student, the author listened to the prayers because he loved her voice, because he loved grandmother's voice, but never bothered to learn it. Then, student, she would fetch his wooden slate, which he had already washed and plastered it with yellow chalk. She would take an earthen ink pot also and a red pen and tie them in a bundle and hand it to the author. And a student, after having a thick, stale chapati with a little butter and sugar spread on it for breakfast, like typical Punjabi breakfast, they used to leave for school, students. And the author's grandmother always accompanied him to the school as it was attached to the temple. A student, the priest taught children the alphabet and the morning prayer, and the children sat in two rows in the veranda. They would sing the alphabet or the prayer in a chorus voice, while the other learned his lesson at school. Their grandmother would read scriptures in the adjoining temple. And students, on their way back, they would feed stale chapatis to the street dogs. So it shows her kind and compassionate nature. But the turning point in the relationship of grandmother also come, students, when the turning point came in their relationship when they moved to the city to stay with author's parents there. In the city, students, the author went to an English school in a motor bus. The grandmother could not accompany him to school. As there were no dogs in the streets, the grandmother took to feeding the sparrows only. So as the years rolled by, students, they saw less of each other. In spite of her immense interest in studies, she could not help him in his lessons as he was learning English. The law of gravity, Archimedes' principles, and many more such things which she could not understand, and this made her unhappy, students. Sometimes she would ask him what the teacher had taught him. Now, student, grandmother did not believe in the things taught at the English school, and she was distressed to learn that there was no teaching about God and the scriptures in the school. Moreover, student, she was very disturbed at the idea of music lessons being given at the English school. Students, to her, music had lewd association, and she considered music to be unsuitable for gentle folk, not good for gentle people. Now, student, comes that common link of friendship gets broken. The common link of friendship between the author and the grandmother was broken when the author went to the university and he was given a room of his own. The grandmother accepted her loneliness and rarely spoke to anyone. The students, all day long, she sat spinning the wheel and reciting her prayers. Only in the afternoon, students, she relaxed for a while to feed the sparrows. This half an hour in which she used to feed the sparrows was the happiest half an hour for her. So these sparrows perched on her shoulders and some even on her head, but she never shooed them away, right? Because it used to be the happiest half hour of the day for her. Now, student, one more point is there that the author leaves for higher studies. Now, the author decides to go abroad for higher studies for 5 years, but the author was sure that his grandmother would be upset at his departure. But she was not even sentimental student when she got to know this thing that her grandson is going. She came to the railway station to see him off. She showed no emotion. She was absorbed in praying and counting the beads of her rosary as usual, students. Silently she kissed his forehead, and the author thought that perhaps it was the last sign of physical contact between them. Now, student, what happens is after 5 years, the author found his grandmother at the railway station to receive him when he returned, and she held him in her arms. She found her more religious and more self contained. He could hear her reciting prayers. Even that day, the happiest moment for her was feeding the sparrows only. So, however, something strange happened to her in that evening. For the first time ever, she did not pray. Instead, she collected the women of the neighborhood and got an old drum and started to sing songs of the homecoming of warriors. Everyone tried to persuade her to stop to avoid overstraining herself, but she didn't listen. As a result of that, she fell ill the next morning, students. Now comes the very sad moment in the lesson, students. Grandmother's death. The grandmother was diagnosed with a mild fever by the doctor, but she insisted that her end was near. She knew this thing. She told everyone that she did not want to talk to anyone and would rather spend her last moments praying. She ignored everyone's protests and started counting the beads of her rosary while praying. After a short while, students, the author noticed that his grandmother's lips stopped moving and the rosary fell from her lifeless fingers. So, student, she died a peaceful death. She was covered with a red shawl. And then, student, do you know what happened? The sparrows also came over there. When the author and others came to take away the grandmother's body, they met a strange sight. To mourn her death, a lot of sparrows had surrounded the grandmother's body. They were all silent. When the author's mother offered the sparrow some bread, students, they ignored. They ignored. They were all silent. They refused to eat anything. And students quietly they flew away after the grandmother's body was carried away for the last rites. So thank you, students. I hope you have understood it. Thank you.